my project. I'll be taking you through 2 recording studios, one a basement studio and one a professional studio where there's not so many rooms. We are going to be given a tour by Mr. Steve Albini. This is his basement studio. When did you build the studio?
Well, I bought the house 3 years ago, and it's sort of been under construction ever since. The basement here was divided into into 2 separate rooms. The first year, there was some acoustic treatment done in the rooms down here. The second year, and the control room was built up on the ground floor that year. This room here hasn't been completed in a final sense because there's still a basement water problem. Whenever it rains, water gets in the basement, and until that gets solved, can't really afford to invest a lot of money in finishing the basement rooms.
Did you buy this house with the intent of making your studio here?
Well, no, I bought it because I intended to live here, but having the studio here was the idea. I mean, whenever I knew wherever I was going to live, I was going to try to build a studio there. It's not a commercial enterprise. I don't do it to make money. I like having a studio around that I can screw around in and other people can record it. And the world needs cheap, shitty 8-track basement studios.
And how long have you been recording bands?
Essentially since I bought the house, yeah. I mean, there's always some loser that wants me to record his band, so, and it's always nice having a place to do it.
Now, let's talk about the acoustics of this room. What keeps sound in or keeps it out?
Okay, this is what we call the live room. And we call it that to distinguish it from the other room, which we call the dead room, but it's by no means is it particularly live. It's got soft tile ceiling, porous tile ceiling, which has been torn out in places and is going to be replaced ultimately. It's concrete wall, wood doors, drywall, essentially hard reflective surfaces, which is why it's called the live room. Use this for anything that we want to have a reverberant field, like drum kits, vocals, things like that.
Now, what would be the difference between having your concrete floor and a rug floor or floor?
Anytime you have an obstruction sticking out from a plane, it reflects sound waves, and whenever the obstruction is small enough or porous enough, it doesn't obstruct the air pressure wave, it diffuses it. So a carpeted, and the frequency that it affects is proportionate to the size of the obstruction anyway. So a carpeting on the floor would tend to absorb or diffuse very small sound waves, that is, high frequency waves. The smaller the wave front is, the more you can fit in the surface specific, like the physical space anyway. So by having a bare floor and bare walls and a relatively bare ceiling, the high frequency energy doesn't get dissipated as much, and you tend to get discrete echoes from solid, straight surfaces instead of diffused sort of, I don't really know how to describe a diffused sound other than diffused.
That sounds pretty good. What is this sponge-like material? What is that?
Okay, this is a closed cell foam. It's soft, squishy stuff, but it doesn't have a lot of mass. And we use these, we stick these up on the wall whenever there's a lot of high frequency stuff going on in this immediate area, because in this part of the live room, the walls are parallel and the floor and the ceiling are fairly close together, and you can get really irritating reflections and phase cancellations. And so we use a limited amount of high frequency dampening stuff back here to keep a lot. For example, specifically when you're recording a drum kit, you have a lot of live mics in one area, and if they're all hearing direct and reflected sound from all sides, they tend to phase cancel a lot, and you get really strange sounds that you can't control too well. So we use a little bit of high frequency damping in the area immediately around the microphones. And that's the same reason there's a carpet on the floor immediately under the drum kit, so that so that high frequency energy doesn't hit the floor, zing back into the microphones and cancel out some of the signal that's hitting the mic from the direct sound source.
Now, you have these doors here.
Yeah, this one is failing on us right now. They're just fairly heavy wooden doors.
Did you build these yourself?
No, these were supplied graciously by the previous owner, by Bud, the previous owner of the house. And the doors were all piled in a heap when we got the place, and we rehung them. But we did that in the middle of the night after everybody had been drinking quite heavily.
Did you have to?
So this one isn't. It's failing right now. This latch isn't working, and this door isn't shutting.
Did you have to put any special treatment on the door to, or
no?
Any
Bud was thinking ahead. Bud was convinced that there was going to be a recording studio in his basement someday, so he built nice, heavy wood doors. We bought a bunch of doors. The doors that seal this part of the house off, and the doors. There's a double door that goes out to the loading door at the back of the house.
Can we see that?
Sure, it's right here. This also will give you an idea about the wall treatment here. This door is mainly a security door. There's no handle on it. It's dead bolted with a lock and just latch bolts on the inside. There's no way to get into the house through this door. You have to open this door from the inside, which I'm sure is illegal as a fire trap and all that sort of shit. But these, you can see the construction of the interior walls from here. There's a 9-inch.
Do you want to get this?
Yeah.
There's a 9-inch airspace between the perimeter wall, which is stone, and the interior wall, which is carpentry, which is drywall and wood. And the airspace acts as a buffer and a base trap. You can see that there's in the corner of the room here where the sump pump is, there's a hole. You can stick your arm in behind the walls on all sides here. And there's a bunch of fuzzy stuff, insulation, foam, and heavy sheeting inside the walls, and so the low frequency wave that propagates out to this end of the room tends to collect in the corner and is dissipated behind these walls. That's to help eliminate the low frequency buildup that you get in small rooms sometimes.
Did you ever try recording with the amplifiers in here?
Yeah. You do guitars in here occasionally. Virtually everything that has been recorded here has been done both here and in the dead environment. There are just two different sounds, and there's different reasons to use either of them. I tend to think drums sound better with natural room reverberation as opposed to a dry, dead environment, and that's just a matter of personal taste.
What would be, when you're recording in a regular recording studio, is everything separated like it is here?
Usually there's better. Here there's no sight line between the two, the dead room and the live room.
Right.
In an actual high class hot shit studio, there's always a sight line. There's always a window or a video hookup or something between the two environments, and that makes life a lot easier. The control room generally can look into both rooms, which is nice. So you can tell when somebody drops a pick, for example, and you can, tell when somebody's about to spill a beer on your $800 bass amp or whatever. What's the difference between all the materials used in this room and in other recording studios? A big hot shit recording studio? Okay. In a big hot shit recording studio, for example, virtually all the walls separating the different rooms would be masonry as opposed to carpentry. And that's because bricks are heavier than wood, and denser material absorbs sound more, stops sound transmission. In this house we had to confront the two major problems of controlling the sound inside the rooms, which is surface treatment, stuff like the foam rubber, or in the dead room, the deadening material, and keeping the sound inside the house from getting out into the world and causing the neighbors to call the police. And that's what the double walls, the thick drywalling, the masonry walls, closing in all the windows, double doors, all that kind of stuff. That's what that stuff is for. That's isolation as opposed to sound reflection control. And to that effect, masonry is better than wood because it's heavier.
So when bands call you and ask for studios, do you suggest this one, or?
No, I don't see. This is a cheap, shitty 8-track basement studio. I mean, I built it to be a cheap, shitty 8-track basement studio where I could work and where my friends could work. Doesn't cost a lot of money, costs virtually no money, but with respect to the amount of money that some people have paid me to work in other studios. It's convenient as shit. I can roll out of bed and start working. And it's comfortable. I mean, I can cook here. It's more like normal life.
Yeah.
Those are the advantages to having a cheap, shitty 8-track basement studio.
What are the advantages in big hot shits?
The advantages of a big hot shit studio is that you virtually always get a more carefully designed recording environment.
Do you feel it's much more personal and the engineer can get more in the band looking at them?
It helps. It's a lot more efficient in terms of time. An 8-track studio solves a lot of problems because you can't allow any indulgences. When you only have 8 tape tracks to play with, nobody has the luxury of getting a brilliant idea at 4 in the morning of having hiring 4 black backing vocalists to come in and sing on a part. You can't do it because there's no room on the tape. But in a 24-track studio, for example, or any classy studio, any big studio where there's a lot of effort put into the design, things tend to go smoother, as opposed to having to run up and down 3 flights of stairs to change a microphone cable. You just walk out a door and change a microphone cable instead of having to hardwire a bunch of stuff into the patch bay and take it out again every time you want to change something around. You just bring in a piece of outboard equipment from a rental company or something. I mean, the advantages to 8-track are that it's cheap and that it's easy and fast. The advantages to a big studio are that virtually always it's more flexible. And in general, big studios can invest more money in things that make a difference in sound quality. Tape machines, stuff like that. A lot of them don't, which I think is pretty embarrassing.
Does this pillar serve any kind of bad purpose in this room? I mean,
the pillar is that's the wood housing for the toilet drain. There's a toilet immediately above your head.
I'm talking about the sound here.
Oh no, it's relatively small. It doesn't have. It's in a symmetrical spot in the room. It's relatively small. It doesn't have much effect at all.
Okay, why don't we move into the dead room?
Cut it.
Okay. This is the dead room. This is where all the amplifiers are for the guitars and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, anything that needs to be recorded in a dry environment. You can probably, I don't know if you can tell in the soundtrack of this thing, but this is considerably less reflective an area. There's carpeting on the floor. The walls have
yeah, what's behind all these
foam,
walls?
There's fabric, and then there's an airspace, and then there's foam panels, and then on the ceiling here you can see it's sort of quilted. I mean, it's an irregular surface under there, and it's
there's like styrofoam stuff.
There's styrofoam panels and foam and other. I mean, there's the construction stuff, and then there's the sound control stuff, as I was telling you before. The construction stuff in this room consists of a brick wall on that side, then a 9-inch airspace similar to the one out there, filled with crap. By crap, I mean fuzzy stuff, insulation foam.
Okay.
Then there's a wooden drywall wall with about 1.5 inches of drywall altogether on the front surface, and that's for mass, because the more mass there is, the less sound transmission there is. All the air spaces on the interior wall were caulked up and sealed with furring strips and felt. And that's because if you seal the air flow from one place to another, that significantly cuts down on the sound transmission. Saw a test once in a Engineer Geek magazine where they took a brick wall and sealed I think it was 10 feet high, 10 feet wide, 8 inches deep, 8-inch thick masonry wall. And they measured the sound transmission from one side to another, and they drilled a hole that was 1 inch in diameter through the middle of the wall. And if you're standing in front of that hole passed something like 12 decibels more sound than the entire rest of the wall.
Oh, wow.
So if you seal up every airspace on a wall, the sound transmission between two areas is considerably less than it would have been otherwise.
Okay, this is the door leading into your laundry facilities. Now, what is basically on this door? Just the same?
It's the same. This is, I mean...
What is this material called?
Cloth.
Is it just regular cotton?
Yeah, this is just I mean, I just went, literally, I went to a fabric store, and they have these tables of, $1 a yard remnants, and I found the 4 biggest rolls I could.
There's not any special kind of acoustical quality to...
Well, it's got 2 layers. I mean, I suppose you could argue that it's denser and is more irregular than, just plain old, like denim would be or something, but I think that's bullshit. I mean, I could say that. Sure, that's what I selected it specially because it's denser and more irregular. Okay. And then underneath here is just another foam panel. It's another closed cell foam. And the reason you use a closed cell rather than an open cell is that an open cell is more like open air, and a closed cell foam is more like sealed air spaces that we talked about.
Now, how much would all this stuff cost to deaden a room and to buy that paneling inside the live room?
It depends on if you just want to treat the interior surface of a room, like the inside of this room. If you just wanted to put all the stuff that I put up on these walls in a room that's already built, it would cost you probably about $300 to do a room this size, $200 or $300. That is, you have to build a frame for the foam panels. You have to put the foam panels up. You have to buy the fabric. You have to buy the foam, the adhesive, stretch the fabric. Whatever it costs you to build the frame. Maybe that might be excessive. You might get by for a couple $100. But when we built this place, we did a lot of other stuff. Like there's this in the corner here. There's a big bass. There's a bass trap here, which goes into another airspace in here. And this airspace is the height of this room, 4 feet deep.
Can you explain bass trap?
Yeah, and it's basically a big empty room that holds a lot of air. And inside that, you put a bunch of deadening shit. In this one, for example, there's foam and mattresses and stuff like that. And what a bass trap does is it takes a low frequency wave, the air wave that's part of a low frequency wave that would have otherwise reflected back into the room and reinforced the low frequencies that are there, and allows the energy of that wave to dissipate into a bunch of soft, fluffy stuff. And it's called a bass trap because they're generally built to handle low frequencies. You can build a trap for any specific frequency that you want, but in small rooms you have a lot of problem with bass resonance. You can probably hear it even in here. Just the air that's moved by my voice, the high frequency stuff dissipates tremendously, but the low frequency stuff kind of hangs around a little. You hear this sort of woofiness, and a certain amount of that isn't a problem. That kind of reinforcement is inherent in a room like this, and that's sort of why you do it. But you have to be able to control it to the point that it doesn't sound terrible.
Now, when bands play down here, they just mic their amps and everything like that. And how much purpose does it serve inside here? It helps quite a bit with isolation. For example, even if the microphone is 3 inches away from the speaker, and presumably it's not going to be hearing much of the room environment. Right. It's just going to be hearing the sound coming off of the speaker. If sound is reflecting back and forth in the room, a certain amount of that is going to phase cancel the air right at the surface of the speaker, and it's going to cause comb filtering effects and just real irritating little ghosts that you can get rid of if you don't have that much reflection. And for example, in a room where you've got several amps live, like the world famous Nate Cato full orange stack here, for example, that's a 120 explosive watts of all English tube power, and you put that in a room with reflective surfaces, and then you try to make it this cheesy Canuck 50-watt bass amp compete with it, and it's just not possible. There'll be so much of that wave reflecting back into the face of the speaker that it'll be impossible to control the sound off the speaker. So you have quite a problem with his playing. I mean, does he turn down?
No, I'm sort of the. I would much rather build a room that accommodates a loud guitar player than tell a guitar player to turn down, because I think there's it's sort of a philosophical thing, but I think there's way too much interference on the part of engineers in most recording sessions.
How much of this kind of detailed work with the sponges and the cloth is done in a big, fancy studio?
Big fancy studios do. I mean, that's
virtually the same thing.
Virtually the same thing. They tend to use more specialized materials. I use stuff that's cheap. For example, the fluffy stuff. The sponge that I use on the walls here costs me about $2 a panel, and a panel is floor to ceiling, 4 feet wide. Okay, it's about $2 or $3 a panel, and I get it from an upholstery wholesaler. Okay, that makes sofas. In a big-time expensive studio, if I was going to build a big-time expensive studio, I would use a different material. I'd use stuff called rock wool. It's granite that's been pulverized and sprayed into fibers, so it's like fiberglass, but it's much, much denser. And as we already know, the denser the material, the more sound, the more energy it can absorb. Right. And so I would have these big panels of rock wool as opposed to foam. And a rock wool panel this big would be about $80. So you can imagine if you've got, 120 panels, rock wool is a much more expensive option. It's for the same reasons that you would put this up here, you'd put rock wool up, and it's a lot more expensive and a lot more efficient. And like I said, all the interior walls in a big expensive studio would probably be masonry as opposed to carpentry, because that's a lot more expensive to build.
Now, did you know everything about the sound reflecting and everything like that before you built this, or did you read up on things when you were?
Yeah, I mean, I've been engineering for about 10 years, and by seeing a lot of studios and seeing a lot of mistakes in a lot of other studios, I knew what I didn't want to do here. A lot of studios spend a lot of money on fixtures and details, like housing for a light here. It consists of a frame of scraps of 1x2 screwed into the ceiling panels. Now, total cost maybe 29 cents. A hot shit recording studio wouldn't want to embarrass its clients by having them sing under such a clumsy, shabby little light fixture. So they would spend, probably $40-50 to get a nice ceiling fixture with a, diffused lighting source and sort of thing. And I suppose for commercial clients that have to use that as their working environment and want to feel comfortable and pampered, I guess it makes sense. But for what I do here, which is basically down and dirty, cheap, shitty basement 8-track recording, the sonic properties are all that really matter. I mean, I don't really care if this place looks like a dung heap, as long as it does what it's supposed to do acoustically. Right. As much as I can afford to have it do.
We're going to move up to the studio where the mixing board is in the control room. So we're here in the control room, where the same cloth is used to keep in the sound or keep out the sound or whatever.
It's slightly different, but it's the same general ideas. It's the same sort of padding stuff is being used to dampen reflections off the walls, but up here the idea is that you don't want sound reflecting in your ears because you're monitoring what's going on downstairs, and downstairs the idea is you don't want the sound reflecting back into the microphones because you don't want it coloring the sound down there. Up here you don't want it to interfere with what you're hearing.
I see. You had these 2 speakers here, especially built, and they're not working out so well. Never have. Why is that?
Well, I had them built to emulate. They're basically copies of monitor speakers that I use a lot, called Tannoy Dreadnoughts. But they use the same basic drivers, except that the drivers are positioned differently. And the reason they don't work in here is that the airspace in here, this is a very small room for a control room. It's about 12 by 12, something like that. 12 by 15, I think, is the actual size. But anyway, and the air volume here is so small that it can't support a low frequency wave that's generated off of speakers that big. So those speakers have proved very confusing to listen to. I see. The low frequencies tends to be very uneven, and you know, basically hard to decipher. So in this room, I tend to listen to the smaller monitors, which are Yamaha NS10s. They're sort of a standard small monitor speaker, but their design is a near field design, which means that they're intended to be placed in relation to your ears so that you hear the sound directly off the speakers and not the sound ambient in the room, whereas the big monitors were intended to be critical field speakers, as speakers that you listen to an equal amount of direct and reflected sound. And in this room, it wasn't possible to have clean reflected sound, so I chose to dampen all the reflected sound.
Right, Steve?
Yeah.
Could you just turn around with your back to the speakers? Just
sorry.
Because I'm just getting the back of the fedora.
Okay.
Yeah, all right, cool.
The speakers, the big speakers now are basically ornaments.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to move them I'm moving the control room up into the attic when I get the attic finished, and that's a much bigger airspace, and I should be able to use the big monitors up more effectively.
And so you'll get an elevator to change microphones and stuff like that.
No, I'm going to install a fireman's pole. I'm really looking forward to that.
That would be fun.
Sort of Batman-like. The back of this room, over in this part here, has a bass trap similar to the bass trap that I built down in the basement, except that because the space in here is so much more confined, I had to make it smaller, and I tried to make it more efficient. That is, not taking up so much room in the room and still providing a large degree of energy absorption. So I made this one much more planar. It's basically a large hanging panel. There's a panel made out of 4 heavy wool blankets and a couple of old army mattresses, and those are suspended inside this frame about 6 or 8 inches away from the wall, so that low frequency waves coming off the speakers tend to go back to the back of the room, collect in the corners, and hide behind that heavy soft stuff, and then have trouble pushing their way back out. It's adequate. It's not the best design, but in a room this small, where the reverberant field out here is pretty negligible, it's proven to be adequate.
Now, can all these machines here that we see do pretty much everything that the big 24 tracks can do? Same kind of
the outboard rack. Yeah, the outboard rack is actually excessive by most people's standards. I've got let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 digital reverbs, 2 digital multi-effects processors, a harmonizer, a bunch of different equalizers,
basically everything.
Limiters, expanders, gates. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of just essentially everything that I think is needed to make general recordings.
Mm-hmm. Are there some effects that you tend to stick with certain instruments that you like to stick with?
Well,
that you look for?
Essentially, the effects that I have are to satisfy other people. I tend to use in stuff that I'm producing and engineering, I tend to use virtually no effects. I tend to think that most bands sound best when they're essentially just their own naked selves, you know. But people want to hear an effect that they've heard on other records, or they want, you know, for emphasis at some point in a song or something, they'll want something extravagant or something cliche or whatever,
mm-hmm.
and I can drag all that shit out for them whenever they want me to. The most common thing.
So you don't like to use any of these, pretty much?
Some of it is useful. The dynamic stuff is useful. Limiters have a purpose when recording vocals, because a vocal range can be really dramatic, something like 80 decibels, you know, from a very intimate little whispery thing to bellowing, and the ability of recording equipment and your ears to translate that big of a dynamic range. It just isn't there. So you have to somewhat constrict that dynamic range of something like a vocalist, so that the little quiet whispery bits are brought up to an audible level, and the big loud screechy bits are brought down to a manageable level, so that they don't obliterate the tape machine. And expanders are useful to eliminate background noise on a sound source that's very defined in its sound character anyway, like a drum or anything with a burst of energy, like a staccato guitar playing or something. You can use expanders, which are essentially the inverse of a limiter, where a compressor. Where a compressor takes the loud parts and the quiet parts and squeezes them together into a narrower dynamic band.
Right.
An expander senses the dynamic level of a signal that's there already and pushes the quieter parts down lower, so that it has the effect of taking the background noise behind an instrument and subduing it even more. And that has its use. The most common thing in the 80s is the horribly processed digital reverb on drum kits, snare drums and bass drums that go and stuff like that. And that's a phase that everybody went through. All the engineers that had ears were playing around with different reverb sounds for so long that finally some of them got popular, and for a while you couldn't hear a record that didn't have that horrible cliched 80s disco snare drum on it,
Mm-hmm.
And I have gear that can do all of that stuff. One of the effects that I like, that I use consistently, is a multi-tap delay on guitars. Especially like sort of crunching, throbbing, huge killer heavy metal guitars tend to sound thin if they're recorded completely dry. So I tend to add 2 or 3 discrete bounces sort of to simulate the sound of the reverberant field of a room on top of a guitar track.
Is that the 6-wall technique?
Yeah. I've got this device here, the Lexicon Pcm 70, has a program in it. Let's see. Yeah. Has a.
Can we get an example of this through what you were going to play for us?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay.
I think so.
This is the 6-wall technique.
Yeah. It's not. Okay. This is the guitar signal by itself. That's with an artificial reverberant field added to it. And then you can change the size of the reverberant field. If I change the distance between the patches. I think maybe the reason I like it is that it's not very dramatic. It's a very subtle effect, and I think that's probably why I like it. And it simulates a natural acoustic phenomenon. That's what I like about it. Most of the reverb algorithms that are used to simulate natural acoustic environments don't sound very real to me. For example. Okay, here's there's a drum kit recorded fairly dry. played through is supposed to simulate a gymnasium.
Really?
It doesn't sound a lot like a gymnasium. There's one that's even more ridiculous. That's supposed to be a concert hall. To me, that just sounds like somebody throwing peas through a soup strainer or something. To be honest, the best thing about effects is that by using them, you can get a client to shut up.
What do you mean, shut
It's
up?
what's called the moving fingers theory.
When they're just all so unsatisfied, you just throw something in. And
Precisely. A lot of people just want to see the engineer's fingers moving. You know, they just want to see him doing something. And for example, I can fire up a bunch of shit here and have all these lights flashing at once, and it'll really look like there's a lot of work going on, but it won't change the sound at all because I'm not using any of the feeds from them. One second here.
It's just not plugged in at all. How often do you have to do this?
Not that often. Maybe for example, if you're working on an album with a band, there may be one member of the band who's really fussy about something, and they just plain won't shut up about whatever this one niggling little irritation is. So if you spend 10 minutes and look like you're really working furiously on that one problem, he'll be satisfied because he thinks that you've probably given him,
This is a technique used by many album producers, or do you think so?
I use it all the time. I don't know about anybody else. Yeah, I mean, for example, okay, this is just give you an example of a. Hang on a second here. Here we go. Give you an example of a totally cliched 80s production technique. Really ridiculously exaggerated snare drum with a heavy-handed reverb on it. Okay. Once that's mixed in, the rest of the band at some point in the session, you can get rid of that effect completely, and as long as they've heard it there once, they'll imagine that it's there, and they'll be quite satisfied.
You ever hear of like someone really getting mad because, hey, it's not like that on the tape you gave us, or they completely forget about it, or just like
completely forget about it in most cases, because a lot of people don't. A lot of people that I work with in the studio are pretty inexperienced, and they think that there is some magic to making things sound good. Like, if only this one effect had been used, or if only this one technique had been employed, or something. And the simple truth is that records sound good when the band sounds good. You can't always ensure that things will be recorded in their most favorable light, but if the guy recording it is not a boob, then it's sort of like computer terminology. When you have garbage data, you get garbage results, and the engineers are often expected to pull rabbits out of their assholes with the boards and the effects and the microphones, and it's just, things will get good to a certain point, and then any further fiddling with them is just going to make them deteriorate beyond that. And a lot of people that put themselves in the position of being producer don't recognize that, and they'll work something to the point that it turns into garbage. And an easy way to circumvent that is to let somebody think that you're really working hard on something when in fact you're not doing anything at all.
So you just...
It's pretty stupid, but I do it all the time.
So it's generally anyone that really has a mind for this stuff and just the urge to do it can buy the materials. Everything's pretty
What,
straightforward
to
enough?
build a studio?
Build a studio. Pretty
It's
simple.
kind of expensive to get into it on a good level. I mean, I bought the best stuff that I could afford. I mean, this console cost $5,000. There was a version of it that would have been less flexible that I could have bought for about $3,500. But because I thought it was worth spending the money on it, I spent the extra money on it. The big monitors that I bought cost me $1,000 a piece. They'll never wear out. I'm not using them right now because they sound like hell, but they'll probably pay for themselves someday. The outboard equipment has been very expensive, but it's.
Where do you pick up things like this? It's not something you see in your local music store.
You know, Maxwell Street. No, you can. There's a whole slew of professional audio dealers, people that sell to studios and people like me, and all it takes is a few phone calls to find them. You know, ask a couple of studios where they get stuff, and they'll turn you on to some places. The money that I spend on this stuff is fine with me because I don't expect to turn a profit on the studio. I bought this stuff so that I could make good recordings. I don't really give a shit if I make any money off the studio. This is where I live more than my studio, more than a place of business. So I'd rather have good equipment here, so it's because it's my studio and I want to be proud of it, than buy cheap stuff on the chance that I can make more money that way. This Clark Technic digital reverb here, for example, a couple of years ago those cost $6,000 a piece. I got a really good deal on mine. I got mine for less than $3,000. But that's still a lot of money. I mean, that's a car. I could have had a car for that, you know. This Lexicon reverb device down here, that was a little over $2,000, $2,400, something like that.
What are the simple, hard necessities you need for a studio? Just for
microphones.
Real minimal effects or anything?
No, I'm real proud of the fact that I've made what I consider to be excellent records, or excellent sounding records, using nothing but microphones and a console.
That's what you like to stick with, and that's it?
Microphones. I can't stress that enough. So many studios buy a bunch of shit like this, thinking that will solve all their problems. When if you don't have decent microphones to record things with, none of this stuff makes any difference, because all this is going to do is, you know, all you'll be doing is putting frosting on a turd, you know.
I think we'll close with that statement. Thanks for having us.
No sweat.